My parents were divorced when I was 7. I never saw my father again. Nobody said anything about my previous life or who I was or what happened. There was like a piece of me missing, and it was the father piece. It was as though half of me was in shadow and half of me was in light. I was a reporter, and in 1980, I was doing a special Sunday feature on historic Black families in Berks County. I was sent to meet Frances Dorsey. And as I was leaving the interview, she called me back and she said, "Heather, was your name Roland?" And I stopped in my tracks. She said, "I worked for your grandmother for more than 30 years. I cooked for her." The most important thing she told me was that my grandmother had followed my life story and events, even though I was estranged from her. When my mother and my father separated, my grandmother came to visit one day on my birthday, and my mother wouldn't let her in, and my grandmother left. She said, "I'm sending all these presents back, and Heather is dead to me." Later on, she used to stand there behind a tree and watch me come out of school. When I married John, she went into the post office, which was across the street, and she watched me come out of the church. What Frances did was she gave me the gift of knowing that my grandmother loved me. So it opened the door for me to be able to go back and see her. There was a kind of shame involved in divorce in the 1950s.
Mom?
I didn't want to hurt my mother. I tried to be respectful of her feelings and of the silence that she needed around this. She made an amazing life for herself and for me, and then she remarried, and my name was changed. I was given a new identity. Had a new home. I had a new family. I lived in a lot of fear for a long time. Fear of losing my mother's love if I pushed too hard to get my story. Fear of what I would find if I really sought out my father. But I did start walking the streets of Reading, particularly North 5th Street, where my paternal grandmother was living. I used to walk out to my father's address. I knocked on the door, but there was no answer. When I reunited with my grandmother in 1980, she was a little senile. It was really Pearl who gave me back my self. Pearl Johnson was a housekeeper, a cook, and a caregiver for my grandmother for 37 years. She told me who I was, through the stories she told me about my grandmother, through the stories she told me about what happened to my father. My father had moved to a room above the bar, which was called the guardhouse. His straits were so dire, he had moved his things in a shopping cart. And he was apparently a neighborhood character who would tell stories at the bar, and he would wear an Aussie hat. This was his life. He unfortunately died in April of 1980, 2 months after I reunited with my grandmother. The day of my father's funeral, my mother looked at me and she said, "Your father didn't abandon you. Don't ever think that he abandoned you. He abandoned himself." At that moment, she gave me such a gift, and I understood what she meant, and it was true. He lost his life to alcohol. That was the big tragedy. I really felt the pull to change my life. I never felt comfortable with things the way they appeared. The silencing in my family, for example, about my life, my story, who I really was, What were those layers underneath everything? Where was the deeper truth? Through the process of listening and writing, I've been able to make peace with the past. I've been able to make peace with my father. I've been able to reimagine him in ways that help me to find a closeness with him through his letters, through the things people have told me about him being a gentle soul and a storyteller and a writer. That's who he wanted to be. That's who he was somewhere. I can connect with that.